you enjoyed your clinical experience, you love dealing with patients, why leave all that and go into the lab? Why pursue research?
There's really one compelling reason. It's the frustration of not being able to do enough for patients.
In the late 1950s, Dr. Mary Ellen Avery was a practicing pediatrician. It was not uncommon for her to encounter premature babies who died because of respiratory distress syndrome. They could not adequately breathe. She decided to explore the syndrome's causes and realized that the lungs lacked a substance called surfactant. She exchanged that information with other researchers, which led to the creation of a surfactant replacement therapy that, when administered to the premature babies, allowed them to breathe freely. This treatment has saved millions of lives.
Normally, a baby develops for 40 weeks before birth, but what happens when a baby arrives at 23 to 37 weeks? Every year, about 15 million babies are born prematurely worldwide. That's 1 out of every 10 babies. In America alone, about 450,000 babies are born prematurely each year. For centuries, as many as 25,000 premature babies died each year. Their lungs collapsed from respiratory distress syndrome, or RDS.
President John F. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline were among the world's most well-known, powerful, and wealthy couples in 1963, but they could not save their baby Patrick.
The newborn son of President and Mrs. Kennedy is dead, the victim of a lung ailment that made it impossible for him to continue breathing.
Back in junior high school, and I know that I was heavily influenced by my next-door neighbor, Dr. Emily Bacon, who was a pediatrician. Actually showed me my first premature baby at that stage in my life, and it made a lasting impression. She loved it. Guess that I felt that might be something I would find satisfying too.
Dr. Avery followed in her neighbor's footsteps and earned her medical degree from Johns Hopkins University in 1952. Soon after graduating, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a lung disease that makes it difficult to breathe. She became fascinated with how the lungs work.
Dr. Avery got well and returned to Johns Hopkins for her internship and residency. Then in 1957, she moved to Boston to do a research fellowship in pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. She worked at Boston Lying In Hospital. It was there that she encountered premature babies who died from respiratory distress syndrome, which was then called hyaline membrane disease. There was nothing she can do to save them.
Dr. Avery had a special empathy for these children due to her own experience with having a lung disease. She began to explore the causes of respiratory distress syndrome.
She examined the lungs of dead cows and pigs and found a foamy mixture of protein and fat called surfactant. She compared these lungs to the lungs of the premature babies she had encountered that died from RDS. The babies' lungs did not have the foamy substance. Dr. Avery had just discovered the cause of respiratory distress syndrome. It was the absence of this surfactant in the baby's lungs that caused the lungs to collapse. Surfactant lowers surface tension and keeps the lungs inflated. Babies do not begin to produce enough surfactant to keep their lungs from collapsing until about 35 weeks gestation.
I like to explain it to parents that I'm sure you've blown up balloons before, but when you're starting to blow up a balloon, it takes a lot of air. You have to blow really, really hard to get the balloon to start to open. And then once it opens, then it's much easier and it blows as big as you want it pretty quickly.
The babies that usually have respiratory distress, they will present with what we call retractions. So every time they take a breath, they really tug hard to breathe, and you can see their ribs. Sometimes you can see up in here where they really suck in to breathe. Sometimes you can see below their rib cage where they are sucking in to breathe, and sometimes they make a noise called grunting.
Once she was certain of her facts, Dr. Avery exchanged this groundbreaking information with the medical community by publishing it in the May 1959 issue of the American Medical Association's Journal of Diseases of Children.
In 1960, Dr. Tetsuro Fujiwara of Japan encountered her article and began exploring respiratory distress syndrome. Dr. Avery collaborated with him. The result was that in 1980, Dr. Fujiwara created a usable surfactant replacement therapy from cow lungs that could be given to human babies with RDS. Clinical trials then began.
Dr. John Clements eventually developed a synthetic surfactant that was easier to produce.
But it took a number of years before surfactant was commercially available. and we didn't even start using it till the 1990s, really the early 1990s.
It took 31 years from the time Dr. Avery discovered the cause of respiratory distress syndrome to the time the FDA approved it as a therapy. After 10,000 clinical trials, the Food and Drug Administration approved surfactant in 1990.
It's at least a 10-year journey costing about $500 million to $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. And it comes all the way from the basic science discovery, through animal models, through IND filing for a new drug discovery, and then clinical trials, and the drug could fail at any point along this long process. So to bring a new drug to market is a big challenge that was successful for the surfactant technology and has gone on to save millions of lives.
Surfactant is the major breakthrough in neonatal care. Before surfactant, we could not help any baby born less than 28 weeks gestation. All of those babies used to die.
Today, babies as small as 23 or 24 weeks can survive, and rarely a 22-weeker can sometimes survive.
When the baby is born, we give them surfactant, which is something that we give into the lungs. We intubate them, and into the lungs we give them a substance called surfactant that helps the lungs, mature also.
Which can save a baby who would otherwise slip away.
Surfactant is now on the United Nations World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. These are medicines that should be available in all functioning health systems at all times.
When we began this work back in the 1950s, the mortality from RDS was above 90%. Today, that mortality is 5% or less.
It's also given to term babies who have other lung problems, pneumonia, something called meconium aspiration syndrome, which cause their big babies who have difficulty breathing and have low oxygen levels. And they also benefit from surfactant.
After several decades of exploration and encounter, the knowledge of surfactant treatment was exchanged with medical doctors, researchers, scientists, pharmacists, and nurses around the world. ABC News reported in 2013 that millions of babies have been saved by giving them surfactant shortly after they were born.
Surfactant was not Dr. Avery's only contribution. Although she died in 2011, her discoveries continued to save lives each year.
She was credited with discovering surfactant deficiency, but she also developed the first isolates that we used in neonatology. She's one that said, if you're going to take care of these babies, you need to have a specialized neonatal intensive care nursery to do it so that the survival will be best. So she really had a huge impact on my field.
I have triplets. They were born at 28 weeks gestation. That was a little bit scary. Each of the triplets received about 3 milliliters of surfactant.
Look what we have. We were very fortunate indeed for everything.
They were so small, I could hold one child in the palm of my hand. My kids are beautiful, healthy, and thriving.
I weigh 2 pounds and 5 ounces. This is my brother Charlie. He weighs 2 pounds, 15 ounces. I weigh 2 pounds and 3 ounces. Look at me now. Hi, I'm Will, and I was born at 28 weeks.
We were all very fortunate that we were born at the right time.
The doctor gave me surfactant.
It's to have watched babies just fade away and die when they were born early. It was to watch them have terrible difficulty breathing and not know how to help them. It's ultimately the awareness of ignorance of what you can do that produces a kind of frustration. Well, there's been a very dramatic change in the care of small infants in the last decade. It's called neonatal intensive care.
Thank you, Dr. Avery.
Okay, again, with more passion.
No. Doctor gave me surfactant. I don't know what that means or whatever.
My name is Charlie, and I weigh 2 pounds, 15 ounces. Look at me now. Ka-ching! Ka-ching, ka-ching! Charlie. Oh dear.